everyone, and welcome to today's TOC webcast. As Yasmina mentioned, I'm Joe Weichert, General Manager at O'Reilly and co-chair of the Tools of Change Conference. As always, I encourage you to visit the official conference site, toccon.com, to keep up with the latest webcasts, podcasts, and upcoming TOC events. Speaking of which, we're now only about a month away from TOC Frankfurt. Don't forget that this year features not only the full-day TOC event on Tuesday, October 11th, but also a half-day social media workshop on Thursday the 13th. For more information or to register, visit tocfrankfurt.com. So for today's webcast, I'm joined by Todd Sattersten. Todd runs BizBookLab and is the author of a very interesting publishing experiment with O'Reilly called Every Book is a Startup. Todd, I'll turn things over to you now so you can tell everyone about this concept and the book project.
Good morning. Thanks, Joe. Thank you. So welcome, everybody. My name is Todd Sattersten, as Joe said, and what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about this concept that I've been throwing around a lot lately, certainly for the last year, and it's the idea that every book is a startup. And I feel like the first place that we have to start, if we're going to buy this metaphor that I have that every book is a startup, is that we have to look at, is this really true? And when I look at things, I see that the relationship that I'm concerned about is the one of the author to the publisher. There's lots of other relationships that are very important in the creation and publication and distribution of a book. The agent is certainly an important role in that process, the distributor, the retail channels. But the metaphor that I'm speaking at in particular is the one between the author and the publisher. And what I want to do is I want to walk through the things that I think each of those parties brings to a relationship. One, as you look at it from the standpoint of the a venture capitalist and or the publisher, and then on the other side as maybe being an entrepreneur and or the author. And I think there are three things that venture capitalists bring to the relationship. The first one is certainly money. In the case of a venture capitalist, what we have is that they've raised a fund. They're normally investing other people's money, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to find the next big thing. Good venture capitalists, I think you will always find, have a very specific point of view about what it is they're trying to do, what their investment strategy is, the sorts of companies that they think are going to be successful, but that also that they can work well with. And I think the third thing that they do is they bring connections. I think in the venture capital industry in particular, one of the key things that venture capitalists are able to help with from the connection standpoint is hiring, in terms of bringing the right personnel into an early startup to make that startup successful and allow it to scale in a way that's going to allow them to get a return on their investment. I think if we walk through those same three things, they're the exact same things that good publishers have. Good publishers bring money to the table. They're the ones who are going to bankroll any given project. I think good publishers have a very specific point of view about the list that they're trying to publish. And I think it's the same thing when we look at the connections that publishers bring. What they bring is privileged relationships. They bring a set of connections, most importantly, and the ones that we would probably recognize most would be to both the media, that's why I have the New York Times sort of listed here, and also to the retail channels. That's something that anyone who is trying to self-publish a book, it's probably the channel distribution part is the one thing, probably one of the key things that publishers or that authors in that space don't have a hard time with. And so on the one side, what we have is we have money and we have point of view, and then what we have is we have some sense of important connections that allow that to be successful. On the other side, what we have is we have entrepreneurs. And I think there's three things that entrepreneurs bring to the table. The first is they're the ones who bring the idea. They see in the marketplace some opportunity for them to be successful, that there is a set of people whose needs are not being met in some way. I think that entrepreneurs, and I think all of us know entrepreneurs, that they bring hard work, and we know how hard it is to start a new business. And entrepreneurs very clearly understand that it is their job to apply that extreme amount of effort, early days, long nights, to making a startup venture successful. And I think the third thing that entrepreneurs do, and I think it's the difference between successful startups and non-successful startups, is that they bring the customers. They bring the customers. And I think if you walk back through, you would see the same thing if we just replaced the word entrepreneurs with authors. Authors bring they bring the idea. They bring in the form of a proposal, and they say, this is the idea that I think needs to be shared out into the marketplace. They certainly are the ones that put in the hard work of writing the book and creating the marketing campaign and publicizing the book. And I think the third piece that they do is they're responsible for bringing the customers. Now, I think what's interesting is the fact that I think this is probably where, when we think about authors and we think about some of the problems between the relationship between publishers and authors, that this is one of the spots where we run into trouble traditionally. Lots of authors come to the publishing process thinking that the hard work is going to be done by the publisher, that the publisher is the one that's going to bring the customers. And I remember when I published a book with Penguin 2 years ago called The 100 Best Business Books of All Time, and I remember talking to my publisher and saying, what's the one thing you should tell me up front? I mean, I kind of know a lot about publishing already, but tell me the one thing I should know. And he said, I can't get your mom to buy the book. I can't do that. Only you can convince your mom and your dad and your cousins and your business colleagues and your college alumni and all the people to buy that book. And so I think when authors bring a mindset, when they bring a mentality to the process that is more entrepreneurial, that we think more from an entrepreneurial standpoint, what we get is, I think we're going to get more successful books. My friend Mark Bloomfield has a saying that publishers have privileged relationships with the media and the retail outlets. Authors have a privileged relationship with the reader. I think that's a perfect acknowledgement of this back and forth between what venture capitalists, a.k.a. publishers, do and what entrepreneurs, a.k.a. authors do. So I think that kind of starts to create a connection. I think we've got a good metaphor here for talking about maybe differently how we thought about publishing than maybe we have in the past. The second thing that's really interesting to me is when we think about this idea of startups and books as startups is that a lot of the people who are talking about startups very intelligently right now, people like Steve Blank and Eric Ries, what they say is that the job of a startup is to search for a business model. Right? To search for a business model. It does not mean that we're going to execute on a business model. It means we need to find one that is successful. And we talk in these same terms, I think, about in publishing when we think about books. What we say to ourselves is this book needs to find its audience, right? We need to find a set of people that are going to find this interesting. And so I think when we think about startups, what we want to think about is that we're searching for a business model. We're searching for what is the right combination of messaging, what is the right combination of pricing and packaging. In commercial publishing, a lot of those are constrained, right? A lot of those, this might be one of the spots where this metaphor might be strained a little bit because a lot of times the price point works in a very specific period of time, or not period of time, but in a very specific window. I think that when we think about the channels that we go out to, we tend to go out to the same channels all the time. But I think us as authors, when we think about that we're searching for, we're trying to find the right combination of things, I think it changes how it is that we think about our book projects. We don't think of it as this thing that we're going to write and then we're just going to put out in the marketplace. We might change how it is that we actually want to release the book or write the book. And it's one of the things that we're doing with this book in particular is that we're searching for customers for this. I openly acknowledge that idea. We're searching for what are the topics that people are interested in. So for those of you who have purchased the book, you've seen my call to action at the end saying, hey, here are the other topics that I want to write about. And I invite people to go to a Get Satisfaction site to share their feedback about what it is they want. And it's been great. We've released 2 chapters of it already. I got great feedback, and we're finishing up the production on the next 2 chapters. They're going to be out in the first part of October. But what we're trying to do with this project in particular is search for the right business model, the right combination of factors that we think can find the audience that will make this book successful. I think we need to think more about that with the books that we do. So let me give you 4 ideas. I want to talk about the 2 ideas that quickly that are in the book now, and I want to kind of highlight the 2 that are going to be coming out in the next update of the book. And the first is the idea that publishing is a hit-driven business. And what's funny is when we hear the media talk about the venture capital industry, they'll always talk about the fact that venture capitalists expect that there are going to be businesses that fail, that there's going to be a home run, there's going to be a double, and there's going to be lots of strikeouts. What's interesting is when the media talks about the publishing industry, and I think you see it in the music industry, maybe in movies, that they want to say that publishers or studios or labels depend on hits. They depend on the really successful stuff. And the answer is yes, that is absolutely correct. That is absolutely the nature of this market, and that's not something that should be discounted. The idea behind this is, and there's very clear science around this, it's called power law distributions. And power law distributions are the idea that we're going to have a few things that are going to be of very, very large magnitude, and we're going to have lots of things that are going to be of very small magnitude. And that's kind of what I'm trying to show with this graph here, right? Well, the magnitude, how big this thing is on that horizontal axis, and the frequency at which it takes place is on the vertical axis. It turns out this power law distribution shows up in a wide variety of places. In any given year, there's an 8.0 earthquake, and those are the ones that we hear about, right? We hear about Japan, we hear about Chile, we hear about Thailand, but what we don't recognize as fully is that there are a million 2.0 earthquakes that take place in that same 12 months. So we have huge frequency of small magnitude, and we have a couple of things that have large magnitude. So this market that we work in is a market of extremes, isn't it? It's a market of we're going to have some really big things happen, and we're going to have lots of small things that happen. And what we talk about is the big things, borrowing from Taleb in his book, The Black Swans, is that we're going to have these things. We're not going to be able to predict them. They're going to be of very large magnitude. And what's interesting is we know exactly what those are. I mean, we could all jump into the chat window and give perfect examples of what black swans are. But Harry Potter and Da Vinci Code and are just a couple. I mean, in the space that I work in, Good to Great is a black swan that continues to sell successfully. I just saw a notice the other day that What to Expect While You're Expecting is coming up on celebrating its 10th year on the New York Times bestseller list. These are black swan kinds of books. They're going to have huge magnitude, but they're not going to happen very often. And most importantly, we're not going to be able to predict when they happen. Chris Anderson has helped us on the other end, right? He named this other end of the thing called the long tail. And what do we know? What we know is that there are lots of people who are going to try to publish a book this year, or they're going to try to launch a business, or they're going to try to put their album out, and that they're only going to sell a handful of copies. I kind of have a rule of thumb that when I talk to authors and publishers, that anybody can sell 100 copies or 200 copies of a book. Anyone can. And I think that's why we see this huge long tail. Anybody just within their network, within the relationships that they have, will find people who will want to buy the book. But what we have to understand is that so we're going to have lots of things that happen like this. There are going to be lots of things that are going to end up in the long tail, and this is the nature of what happens. Publishers understand this. Publishers understand that they're going to have some stuff that is going to be very successful for them. They're going to have black swans, but what they also understand is that they're going to have books that are going to end up in the long tail, and they're just never going to escape from there. Entrepreneurs have to understand that, right? The only way to get past this idea of the extremes is the fact that we have to produce more books as entrepreneurs, or we have to have more ideas. We have to understand when a startup isn't going to work, walk away from it, and then be willing to start something else. What Chris Anderson also wanted to talk about in the long tail is the idea that maybe the shape of this curve is going to change in some way. And what's interesting is there's been some really great research that shows that it probably actually isn't going to change. Anita Elbers has probably done the best work on this. And what she looked at was how media, in particular movies, were rated. And what she did is she divided the people that were rating the movies into two sections. We had the people who were kind of casual people, casual readers or casual movie watchers, and then the ones that rented lots of movies. And what she found, she did this both for music using Rhapsody and for using QuickFlix, which is sort of the Netflix of Australia. And she divided out these two groups by their usage patterns and then looked at how they rated stuff. And what she found was that the folks who are the casual users kind of rate everything pretty much the same. There's an average, and there's kind of a standard distribution around either side. Some people say I like it more. Some people say I like it less. But what she found for the people who rented lots of stuff was the fact that they like dipping into the long tail. They love trying to find that hidden gem. But in example after example after example, what they do is they tend to rate those things lower than the casual user. And the hits, those same people that you would think are very discerning because they're always trying to find a new thing, they're trying to find the best movie that they can, what they also do is they rate the hits higher. And so what happens inside of that is the fact that it gets so much more difficult for us to find movies because the people that we think are going to bring us to the gems actually, to the long tail, actually push things further down into the long tail. And the people you'd think, oh, they're not going to be the people who like hits, they actually push the hits further out. So the long tail is going to be the long tail for a long time. And I talk about this more in depth inside the ebook. But understanding power law distributions and that we don't work in an industry of averages. What we do is we work in an industry of extremes is a very important first step for us understanding how startups apply to publishing. The second idea is this. And I love this quote from Paul Graham. He runs Y Combinator. They're an incubator for startups. If you're not familiar with them, I would encourage you to go check out the work that they're doing. They've already launched in, I think, a matter of 6 years, over 300 startups. And what he says is this is the thing that entrepreneurs need to do. We have to make something that actually makes people's lives better. It's funny how straightforward that is, right? And what happens is that what we do in publishing is we spend a lot of time saying, look at this book. Isn't it cool? You really need to check it out. And there was a Harvard Business School professor by the name of Ted Levitt, and he had this wonderful phrase that said, what people want isn't the quarter-inch drill. What they want is the whole, right? What they want is the thing that object does. And so in MBA speak, what we like to do is we like to talk about the difference between features and benefits, right? These are features. These are, look at all these individual components, look at all these different things, and let me take you to the chart on the side to show why each one of these individual components is important. These are features. What this is this is the benefit. The benefit is I get to hang stuff on the wall. I get to build furniture. I get to do amazing things if I have the right tools to do that. Features say, hey, look at me. Look how cool I am. What benefits do is they say, hey, look how cool you are. And if you follow at all Kathy Sierra and her work around making awesome user experiences, she has this pegged in spades. Go look up her TOC talk on YouTube from this year in New York. She pegs this idea perfectly of talking about what it is to make things that make users better. There's a friend of mine, Ray Bard, down in Austin, Texas, who runs a small press called Bard Press, and he takes this kind of one step further. And what he says is that he calls it felt need, this idea of talking about benefits, getting to what it is that our customers, what our users want. He calls it felt need. And what he does, he likes to create this great graph trying to figure out what sorts of books he should publish. And he has felt need kind of on one axis, and he has audience size on the other axis. And when you have an idea that has a very small felt need around it, and there's a very small group of people who be interested in it, it's a pond. He even calls it a puddle because you're going to have a very hard time commercially publishing a book in that space. The long tail is the story of puddles. But if we still take that small audience size and we increase the felt need, what we get is we get a well. And I think, for example, Every Book is a Startup is a well kind of book. There's a set of people, both in the author community, trying to figure out what it is that they should be doing with the crazy chaos that's going on, and also the same thing in the publishing community. The publishing professionals are trying to make sense of it. What are metaphors? What are examples I can use to better inform the decisions that I'm trying to make? Their well books, I think, are what we would often call mid-list kinds of books. They're not necessarily bread and butter, but they are bread and butter books for lots of publishers. I think what happens is that when we increase that audience size, that the place that we get into trouble with so many books is that we get into the bayou. And these are books that, yes, they do potentially have a huge audience size. But what happens is that there's no felt need for them. There's no one that actually wants to read that book. And all of us who work in publishing, we can all think of examples that follow that. We've all published books like that, right? And we kind of look back and go, oh, we should have known better. We should have known that there was, yes, we thought there was this big, huge audience for it, but we should have recognized better that there wasn't any felt need. And the ocean is, that's what we're always shooting for, isn't it? We're always shooting for those books that have a huge, deep felt need, and that there's a vast, wide range of people that are going to want that book. Another example, like I was talking about with what to expect while you're expecting, the 40th edition of What Color Is Your Parachute is coming out this year. The 40th edition. It was published. I just turned 40 a week ago, and this book is as old as me. Here's a book that captures an incredible felt need, independent of economic climate, and that there's a huge audience of people. There's an ocean audience here. And again, I'll bet you if you kind of take this lens and lay it over the top of either your idea as an author or as a publisher, that there'll be a lot that rings true here about making sure that we understand both audience size but also felt need. The other part that strikes me when we think about felt need is the fact that we need to convince our audience that the message that we're trying to convey is going to be successful. And I love this graph. It was in Resonate from Nancy Duarte. And what she talks about is in presentations, what we need to do is we need to keep going back and forth between the present and the future. And we need to acknowledge the gap between those two. We have to talk about what is, where that person is right now, and what we want to do is we want to set up those future aspirations for what could be, while clearly acknowledging the pain in between, clearly acknowledging that. And what the job of us as publishers and authors and marketers is to address the pain, isn't it? It's to create products and also not only address the pain, but recognize whether or not there is pain, right? That really goes back to the prior chart, that if the step function that I'm sort of describing here, if the sine wave is really not very tall, there's probably not a commercially viable book there for it. It's the difference, between taking that person from I'm okay, everything's fine, to I'm totally awesome now. I think this is something we screw up on, again, over and over inside publishing, because what we do is we think of ourselves, like if you see the two figures in this drawing, the question I would ask you is, which one do you identify with as the publisher, as the author? Who is it in here that you are? Right? Because oftentimes I think we think of ourselves as Luke. We think of ourselves as the hero. We're here to help everyone else. And I think we've got a bad metaphor there. I think we've got a bad mental construct for that. Because I think it's more appropriate for us to think of ourselves as Yoda. To think of ourselves as our job is to help the heroes. Our job is to find that felt need and deliver a set of experiences, a set of books that is going to help them on their journey. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea that in startups we have to make lots and lots of choices. It's probably the choices that we make are probably the most important things that we have in any given startup. When we get to a point where we have an established business model that we're executing upon, where we're a publisher and we have those retail relationships and we have good relationships with agents, we know the kind of stuff that we're doing, the number of choices that we have to make decreases, right? Because we can bring other people into the organization. But in that initial point, when we're trying to get the venture off the ground, there's a lot of decisions that we're trying to navigate. And what's interesting is that authors, when they write books, have that exact same problem. If you think about the option that any author has, they could start the beginning of their book just saying, London, 1865, right? It gives away a whole sort of stuff, right? We know sort of where it takes place, and we know what year it's done, and we might start kind of trying to pull things together from what that means to us. But what happens more often is the author tries to describe the scene, right? They describe the sights and the sounds, the people, what they're wearing. If it's a Sherlock Holmes mystery, right, we hear the scream and people come running and the dead body is lying on the ground with the footsteps off into the distance, and suddenly there's a mystery that needs to be solved. And when we describe all of those things, we could say that London 1865, but when the author brings in the sights and the sounds, they pull together a whole set of ideas that enriches the experience for the reader. And I always find this really interesting when I read books and when I look at the choices that authors make about how it is that they introduce a book, what examples they use, what metaphors they use. And what's interesting is that Stephen Johnson, in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From, talks about this from a different standpoint. And what he says is that when we read a book and we have that aha moment, right, we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, yes, this is exactly what I was thinking. And we've all had this experiences with the books that we've read. We've read it in proposals that we want to publish. We've read it in the books that we love reading. It happens in fiction. It happens in nonfiction. And here's what Johnson says. He says that the metaphor that we use there, that aha moment, is flawed. And he says there's dozens of different metaphors we use colloquially to invoke good ideas. We call them sparks, flashes, light bulb moments, which is kind of ironic because of the image I'm showing you there and what the publisher actually chose to use. There's something about the concept that pushes our language into rhetorical overdrive. We talk about brainstorms and breakthroughs and eureka moments and epiphanies. Our verbiage strains to reproduce the innovation it describes. And what he says is that it isn't that we have this some flash of brilliance, right? what we have is actually in our brains, there's a set of connections that take place. There's a set of connections that we haven't seen before. There's, as he says, a single constellation of neurons, thousands of them firing in sync with each other for the first time in our brains. And an idea pops into our head. He says that an idea is a network. I want you to think about that for a minute because I love what he's saying there. An idea is a network because if an idea is a network, then we certainly would have to say that a book is a network. And that what we do is we make a variety of very conscious decisions around what things we're going to connect together to make that network. My decision to come up to title this book and work with Joe and say, every book is a startup, is a set of ideas, right? Books connect to this old thing. Startups connect to this new thing. The word every, right, says that this is something that we should be doing over and over and over again. We relate to, on the startup side, this idea of the trials and tribulations of being an entrepreneur. Think of just within those simple set of words, what is it, 5, 6? All the things that I bring to bear on this very particular problem that I'm trying to talk about. And we know good authors and we know good titles that do exactly the same thing. There's an advertising executive of the late Phil Duesenberry who talked about the same thing. And he wrote this great book, and it was called One Great Idea is Worth 1,000 Good. One Great Insight is Worth 1,000 Good Ideas. And what he says is that ideas are a dime a dozen. Anyone can have them. They can be good or bad ideas, saving your hide in some cases, wasting your time in others. The best thing about a good idea is it forces you to act. Insights are rarer and infinitely more precious. A strong insight can fuel 1,000 ideas, 1,000 reasons to act, and make something happen. That, more than anything, should be your reason to fight and preserve for your own insight moments. When you're armed with a powerful insight, the ideas never stop flowing. We've had this experience over and over and over again in publishing. When we find that saying that describes better than anything else what it is that we're trying to do, that's an insight. And I think an insight is a network. When he says there's a whole bunch of ideas that come flowing from a given insight, I think it's because it taps into a network, and we keep seeing more and more connections out into that broader network. And I think we should try to think of books as networks more often. I guess the metaphor that I have for this is if an idea is a light bulb, as Johnson describes it, what we want to do is we want to build the Rockefeller Christmas tree. You know, the one that they put up in Rockefeller Center every holiday season. And what we have is we constantly have the opportunity to pick what strings of lights we want to plug into the outlet. And I think there's some authors that are very specific about this. They're very deliberate. I think others are not. And I think that we could construct our insights in our books better if we thought more about the networks that we're tapping into. I mean, what I did was for every book as a startup, I tried to just quickly yesterday put together what are all the things that are connecting together, and are these the right 2 words? And you can see there's all these things that books tap into and startups tap into. And again, if we put this up on, sort of a sharing site, we could keep drawing in all of these other connections and hopefully see more things why this connecting books to startups is such a powerful metaphor. But what I'd love for you to think about is books as metaphors. I think that, books as networks. I think it expands our view of both how we can be successful with them. I think that what often happens is that I think as marketers and publicists, that when they end up with a book on their desk, they fully understand this idea. They're always looking for who else in the network would be interested in this. What sort of publicity, what companies, but that's oftentimes so far after when it would be successful and when it would be helpful. The more we can think about the book as a network further on up in the process, I think we improve. It's those decisions that I was talking about earlier, that we have decisions that we have to make. And it's what nodes in the network that we want to connect to our startup and to our idea. The last idea that I want to talk about is was an idea proposed by a guy named Kevin Manny, and he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Trade-Off. And his argument is this. He says products or services in any marketplace sit along a continuum between two ideas, either fidelity or convenience. So on one end, what we have is we have this fidelity, and we all recognize that, right? We recognize high-definition experiences, those high-prestige experiences. Going and actually seeing the Gutenberg Bible is a high-fidelity experience, isn't it? Versus convenience, right? We know what convenience is. Convenience is simple. It's easier to use. It's cheaper, right? Just the fact that it's cheaper means that I can use it more often. And I find this theory really, really provocative when you start applying it to publishing, because we could look at any aspect of publishing. We could look at particular books, and we could say to ourselves, what books in a given segment play towards the convenience side of the spectrum, something that's easy to read, that's more inexpensive, versus the fidelity side of the spectrum. For example, we could take Nathan Myhrvold's Modern Cuisine, $625 for a 5-volume, I think it's 2,400-page magnum opus to the science of cooking, to modernist cooking. That is certainly a high-fidelity experience in the publishing realm. At the same time, I could go to my iPhone and download the Food Network app for $1.99, have access to a number of their celebrity chefs and thousands of recipes. And I could have it in about 30 seconds, right? I could have it before I could even, finish this last section of the talk. And I think that we can apply it to products. I think when I look at what's happening in the retail space, the retail side of our publishing realm, what we see is we see Amazon playing hard and heavy, as they always have, towards the convenience side of the spectrum. They've always been about infinite shelf space. Whatever it is that you want, we'll have it. They've always been about how do I make it as cheap as possible so that we can sell as much as possible. And they've always been about making it as easy as possible to do that. I think what's interesting is that I think bricks and mortar bookstores used to be the fidelity experience. And it progressively moved out. It was the independent bookstore, and then it was the mall stores, and then it was the big box stores. And I think what's happening is that over time, all of that is shifting into this kind of middle realm where we can't really figure out, is it convenient or is it high fidelity? Because I think what's happened is the high fidelity experiences, the idea that you used to go to the bookstore to hear the speaker speak, to gather with like-minded people, has been usurped by other higher fidelity experiences. South by Southwest, Comic-Con, Maker Faire, PopTech, TED. When you think about those experiences, more expensive experiences, experiences that take a lot more effort to get there. I just saw a tweet that South by Southwest that this morning that almost all of the hotels are already booked for next year's South by Southwest. The difficulty, all that it takes to get there, but the experience that we have once we're there, the people we get to interact with, the topics that we get to talk about with like-minded people are an order of magnitude higher. And so I think what we want to think about is this idea of fidelity and convenience and what it means to our industry. Because what's interesting is that there's a guy, Clay Christensen, who's talked an awful lot about innovation. And innovation at its core is about startups, isn't it? It's about how do I develop new technologies and new business models to take to market that will better serve the needs of customers. And he does the same thing. He says that on one end we have sustaining innovation. What we're doing is we're trying to improve upon, make better the products that are already out in the marketplace, helping customers that we already have. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have disruptive innovation. And the hallmarks of disruptive innovation in every instance is always it's cheaper, it's easier to use, and it's more convenient. Those are the words in particular that he uses to describe it. And so in the case of, I think, what's happened in publishing, most of the innovation, and big box was an innovation, mall stores were an innovation, Amazon was an innovation, is that these were disruptive innovations, but they were low-end disruptive innovations. What they were is they were redefining business models around how do I provide a lower-cost product to people. There's other wonderful examples of new technology that are disrupting industries. And so when I think about this idea of what our choices are when we look at these spectrums of fidelity versus convenience, sustaining innovations, let me just back up. Sustaining innovations for publishing, if you want me to directly tie it in, it's the idea that sustaining innovations in publishing it's what we acquire every day. It's the fact that we're always looking for another book that's going to suit the audience that we already have, right? And those are sustaining innovations. And what's happening now is that there's a variety of people that are trying to disrupt everything that traditional and all of us are trying to do already with our sustaining innovations of what does it mean for iPhone apps? How do those match up to? Is there even the same set of customers for those than there are for books? And at what point do the apps end up doing a better job than books? We can all think of lots of examples, wonderful examples that we would hold up and say, gosh, in this case, these disruptive innovations are better than the books that we're producing. And that it's only in our best interest to try to disrupt our own business models. So when I look at fidelity versus convenience, and I look at sustaining innovations versus disruptive innovations, what I think it boils down to is that we have one of two choices. Either what we're going to do is we're going to add more things to what it is that we do in the marketplace, or we're going to subtract and we're going to take away. For those of you who are familiar with 37 Signals and their Basecamp product, what they would tell you is that they were all about subtracting. They're all about taking as many features as they could out of the traditional project management packages, software packages, and really selling a product to a whole set of people that never used project management software before, partly because of cost, partly because of difficulty, because the solutions were just too heavyweight for the projects that they were trying to manage, right? And the other thing, we could say the same thing, that we're always trying to add as well. We're trying to find an idea that better suits the customers that we have. I think it's important just for us to understand which side of that spectrum that we are in. Is our responsibility to subtract and disrupt, or are we adding? And when we make those decisions, when we make those choices, just to consciously acknowledge that we are doing them. I think that in this case, in the case of the ebook, in the case of Every Book is a Startup, I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to simplify, I'm trying to subtract, I'm trying to take away as much as possible, connect a network of things together, and show you a different way to sort of see the world than what's been done before. And so I'm going to sort of end sort of things there. The ebook right now that, sometime next year we're going to turn into an actual physical book. It's called Every Book is a Startup. It's the new business of publishing. Joe, where do you want to take things from here?
Well, first of all, thanks, Todd. Great overview. And if I can just mention a couple of things about the book cover that you're looking at here right now. As Todd said, this is an ebook format right now, but as the saying goes, we're trying to eat our own dog food, right? And this is kind of a fragment of a book. And if you were to go over to buy it today at that link, you would find that there are a couple of short chapters in place, and then Todd has kind of laid out some of his thinking for what he wants to write for the rest of the book. But as he also mentioned, we're looking to engage our audience, the customer base, using sort of this agile development model where we put out the minimum viable product, in this case the 2 short chapters, and then we ask for feedback. And so Todd has this Get Satisfaction page set up, and you can communicate directly with him, comment about the book, and help shape the future development of it. Also, the other cool thing about this is we're experimenting with a kind of a dynamic pricing model on it. So if you buy it now, it's $4.99, and eventually, as Todd adds more and more content, we're going to be taking the price up. But if you buy it now at $4.99, you'll never pay anything more for it. You'll get all those free updates pushed out to you automatically through the O'Reilly ebook update platform. And that was something I mentioned in the group chat window earlier, that we're the only place where you can really buy this in this format, because Amazon, Apple, all the others out there really don't offer that kind of a dynamic model, at least at this point. So we like to think we're kind of blazing a trail here, and we definitely welcome your input on it. So shifting gears from there, Todd, we've had a number of questions come up. Let me go through a few in the remaining minutes here. So you talked earlier about Bayou books. Can you give any examples of what you had in mind there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens here is that I'm afraid that my examples are going to be very specific to the genre that I hang out in. But I think what ends up happening is that we think we can publish I'll give you an example. I got an email yesterday from someone who has written a book on how to improve your memory. And they even had an agent, and they tried to shop it, and they had a very difficult time trying to convince publishers that there's a market for this book. And I think what the publishers that they talked to felt in that space is that there just isn't a felt need. There may be a very wide audience for this idea of this book. There might be lots of people who are constantly saying, gosh, I've just got such bad memory. But there aren't a lot of people who are saying, I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to spend time today trying to actively improve my memory. As a matter of fact, most people would say that, we're outsourcing a lot of our memory now, right? That we're using the internet to do that more and more and more. I don't have to remember as many facts as I used to. And I think that we sort of naturally, as publishers, we have a certain gauge for what felt need is. I think another thing that I would say is that I think this is one of the spots that authors get into a lot of trouble about in terms of when they want to write a book, that I think there's a difference between writing a book for yourself and writing a book that is going to be commercially successful, that you can find an audience for. And I think it's that difference of, I've written a book about my experiences in the Vietnam War. Pick whatever experience that you've had. 9/11's coming up. And the question is whether or not there may be a wide audience of people that want to do that. The question is there a strong enough felt need for an audience of people to cross the street to go buy a book about it, and in particular, a book about it that you've written from your experience?
Okay, got it. So related to that, one of the audience members was asking about finding the felt need or creating the felt need, and when they mentioned, what would Steve Jobs say? Which, frankly, I think that he obviously has done a terrific job of creating felt needs, and it sort of reminds me of that old Henry Ford line there, where he said if he would have listened to his customers, he just would have built faster horses, right? So, which way do you go here, or can you look at either?
Yeah, that's the chicken and the egg, right? And I'm not going to I'm not sure I'm going to make some incredibly strong case for one versus the other. I certainly know that, we in publishing, when we look at proposals, we always want to see the comps, right? So what we always want to do is we always want to, on one side, play the game that says there is a felt need for this. And the way I'm going to demonstrate that felt need is the fact that there are other books that have been published on this topic, and that here is how well those books have sold. So on the one side, I would say that we as publishers, we want to feel pretty comfortable with the fact that there's already, and that hopefully someone else has found that felt need for us, and that we can tap into that. I think this other side of creating felt need is, when you talk to the folks who are saying the really interesting stuff in the startup space right now, folks like Eric Ries, and I would encourage people to go get a copy of The Lean Startup. I think it comes out. I think it's out. It might be out today or tomorrow. He talks very specifically about this idea of customer development, this idea that startups, their biggest problem of any startup is the fact that they have misidentified the problem. And oftentimes the fact that there is no problem out there. It's another way of saying, gosh, is there a felt need for this? And that the good startups, what they do is they go out and they talk to customers about what their problems are. It may be that they haven't necessarily proposed a solution, but they're talking to their customers. This is classic sort of what good salespeople do, right? They go out and they talk to their customers about the problems that they're having, and then obviously try to address either the solution that they have and say, look, this is the solution I have, this is how it can potentially help solve your problem. Or they'll go back to the marketing folks and say, hey, product development, I see this, I'm talking to people, I see this need, can we do something? And it isn't necessarily proposing the solution. I think there's a lot of times, I think one of the things we get ourselves in trouble with when we get around this idea of do we create the felt need or is the felt need already there, is the fact that when you go to an individual, and the brain research on this is super clear, that when you go to someone and you ask them what they might do and then go back and measure what they actually do in relationship to the first question, it is always 100% different. Not 100%, but it is always markedly different. And so the problem is you can't go to someone and you can't say to them, I've got this idea. What I'm thinking about doing is X, Y, and Z. Would you buy that? Because there's lots of people who are your friends or have a particular pain point. Until they can concretely see what it is that you are selling and interact with whatever that thing is, that is the only way that you can assess felt need. That's the only way that you can see whether or not someone is really going to be really willing to separate themselves from their money for the product or service that you are providing. I'm not going to argue against the idea that I think some books can create felt need. I was thinking of the example I just gave about the book about memory. I went back to the person who wrote the book and I said, what you should be doing is you should be tying to the Joshua Farrell book, Moonwalking with Einstein. It's this wonderful narrative that came out earlier this year about memory. It's about how he came, actually, I think he went on to win the memory championship. There's a championship that takes place every year. Now, what I was saying probably goes back to the first part, which is, hey, look, there's some felt need, and this book did pretty well, and a lot of people were really interested in it. And it could be because it was his story, but there were clearly people interested in the idea of what memory is. And I'm willing to bet you that there's a subset of people who would buy a tactical book around that. So I'm probably trying to play the middle space here, but I tend to think the idea is that felt need exists. Customers, if you ask them, don't know how to express it. And that, back to your example, Joe, about Steve Jobs, he has always found a way over and over and over again to take a felt need that a particular audience has and embody it in the products that he produces. And they couldn't have told you in advance that they wanted it, But once they saw it, they said, yes, it's exactly what I needed.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just got time for one last question, and it's a tricky one, Todd, so I'm going to throw it at you anyhow. So one of the audience members says, as a publisher of fiction, I'm both finding and creating felt want, not felt need. I'm finding and creating not solutions but worlds. And does that dictate a different way of doing business?
I think that this idea of felt need still exists inside of fiction. I think that back to the Ted Levitt idea that we talked about earlier of, is it the drill or is it the hole? Clay Christensen took that idea, one step forward, and what he said was that he said you have to look at what job people are hiring your products for, right? What job, what felt need are they actually hiring for? I think fiction, there's lots of different reasons that people buy fiction. I think for some people, they buy it as entertainment. I think some people buy it to make sense of a certain experience in their life. It's another way to access. You might say, oh, well, why don't you just buy a piece of nonfiction? Well, it's because sometimes fiction does an even better job at exploring the issues around something. So the question what I would pose back to the person who said it is that I think you're right that you are creating worlds. What I would explore is asking your customers more and more why they hire your books. I think that it's sort of like I said to somebody, I think there's some people that have a felt need about zombies, which is silly, right? I mean, zombies, come on. There are some people, though, that will read every zombie book because they want to know more about zombies. They want to see how other people interact with zombies, how people change the story. And that might be a sort of a superfluous, very, sort of simplistic answer, but the argument that I'd make is I think there's varying felt need around why someone hires books. I think in particular in fiction, sometimes we're hiring the author because we like the stories that they told us in the past and the world that they've taken us to. I think sometimes we're hiring a book because we're trying to escape everything else that's going on. Sometimes we're hiring a book because it makes better sense of the world that we're already in. And so, again, I feel like I might be walking a middle line here, Joe, but what I would say to that person is to think harder not about the story, but why the person is hiring that story in particular.
Makes sense. Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, and there were a few questions we didn't get to. But what I'm going to suggest is I'll put a link up here into the group chat window, Todd, for the Get Satisfaction page for Every Book is a Startup, and maybe we can kind of continue the dialogue over there. But I want to thank you, Todd, for the terrific presentation, and also thanks to everybody who attended today. Again, be sure to keep an eye on TOCCon.com for future events, and we'll see you again soon.